Since the moderator stood up, I might as well also stand up. The chairs are so comfortable. Of course, the temptation is just to sit there for an hour and relax, but I'll try to resist that temptation. First of all, Stan, thank you very much for the invitation. This is a great event. It's really an honor to be here, standing in front of some very, very distinguished individuals. And as we say in Africa, all protocols observed. All protocols observed. We're going to talk about Africa, a very complex continent. And by the way, Stan mentioned 50 nations. As a good prof, let me correct him and say we have in Africa something like 300 nations. 300 nations that could be recognized as such. Many of these nations are looking for a state. Many of these nations are looking for a state, and they're not there yet. And this is one of the things that makes Africa, first of all, so complex, and secondly, so important, because is in that negotiation between the nation and the state that you have a lot of conflicts. You have a lot of would-be states that they have all the attributes of statehood, except sovereignty, which is the topic of this conversation. Many of these nations have, their language, their territory, their customs, they have a religion, and so on. You go down the list. All of the things that make a state, they have it. And oftentimes, they were considered a sovereign entity by others until the advent of colonialism. So now you have a situation where you have hundreds of nations, but you only have 54 states. You only have 54 states. So what you really have are a number of entities trying to fit into a construct that is completely foreign to them. It's artificial. It's fairly recent. Conference of Berlin. Right? So we have that dimension that brings together the political sovereignty aspect into the equation. I just wanted to touch on a couple of topics to introduce the conversation so that hopefully there'll be questions from you so that we can delve into some of these issues with some greater depth. First of all, political development. You cannot understand Africa without focusing on political development. Where is Africa coming from? Where is Africa coming from? Africa is coming from centuries of external domination. Centuries of external domination. We have no time to look into that particular history, but it's critical for you to understand Africa. Was that external engagement that has really affected the trajectory of politics in Africa. There were a lot, and by the way, a lot of people ask the question, well, why is it that democracy is so problematic in Africa? Well, democracy in Africa is very recent. It's about 50 years. But the history of colonialism was not democratic at all. You had democratic countries oppressing other countries. So the structures of politics that the Europeans set up in Africa were completely undemocratic. Completely. So for you to understand political development in Africa, you have to understand that. So when we see a prevalence of one-party politics in Africa, people ask, what's wrong with you? What's the matter with you? Why don't you have a democratic system? Well, our teachers taught us one-party politics. That's why. Why is it that you have now, after the end of the Cold War, why is it that you have dominant party politics? Well, we're evolving. You know, it was one-party politics. Now we have dominant party politics. It's all because of that history. Africa is on a trajectory. Okay? Africa is on a trajectory. Democracy is taking root in Africa. You know, my buddy and I were just reflecting on what's going on in South Africa, basically as we speak. If you're not following South Africa, well, the president of South Africa decided to use something like, what, $20 million, something like that, to upgrade his house. Okay? He said, well, you know, I got a house, I need some upgrading. Indoor pool and so on and so forth. You know, he tallied up to about $20 million. Public funds. And by the way, in Africa, many presidents have a hard time distinguishing public funds and private funds. You know, apparently, this is the case in other parts of the world too, but I'm talking about Africa. So, for a couple of years, Parliament has been on his back, you know, the opposition in Parliament. Pay the money back, pay the money back. He said, no, I'm not going to. The opposition party took it all the way up to the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court as they call it. The court told the president to pay. The president just the other day went before the nation and says, well, I guess I'm going to have to pay. And then he just survived an impeachment motion a couple of days ago. So democracy in Africa is taking root. And I could use several other examples across the continent to make that point. So my point is, there's been a trajectory from colonialism, complete oppression, to one-party politics, to dominant party politics. Now we are getting to the point where we can point to some good examples of democracy in Africa. Stan, you're going to have to tell me when to stop. You know, profs go for about 15 minutes, lecturing. So tell me when I'm about 15 minutes into it. Let me just touch on economics. The image we normally have of Africa is that of a backward continent, economic basket case. Well, maybe that used to be the case. Not anymore. Not anymore. For the last decade or so, up until the commodity prices started to decline, Africa was doing very, very well. Africa was outperforming, on average, on the aggregate, just about every region in the world. Very, very dynamic place from an economics perspective. Here in the United States, the images of Africa, and I remember teaching a course up at St. Lawrence University on the images of Africa. The images we have of Africa are completely distorted. So therefore, when we look at Africa, we see that continent as the ideal recipient of our aid. We do not see that continent as a natural space to make money, to put it bluntly, here in the United States. Others around the world are not making the same mistake. China, for example, to use one example, has recognized Africa as the last frontier when it comes to economics. The African middle class is about 150 million already. The projections are that, give it another 20 years or so, the African middle class will be comparable to the African middle class, size-wise, in other regions. You know, speaking of demographics, let me give you another one. Nigeria, in about 20 years' time, will have more people than the United States. Nigeria, the projections are that Nigeria, give it another 50 years, will be one of the most populous countries in the world. Here in the United States, we are still, when we think Nigeria, we think in chaos, we think in Boko Haram, we think in all sorts of other things. But we need to take a closer look. We need to take a closer look and understand that from a strategic perspective, Nigeria is important, for good and bad. Speaking of Nigeria, you cannot talk about Nigeria without talking about security. And Nigeria is an interesting laboratory when we try to understand security in Africa. The Nigerian state made, well, yeah, it is a mistake. Because, and by the way, this is a mistake that you see across the continent in defining security purely from a traditional state-centric perspective. Again, goes back to where I started, neglecting the nation, neglecting the ethno-linguistic units that make up the modern African states. Looking at security just from a state-centric and oftentimes land-centric perspective. Neglected issues that pertain to non-traditional threats. And the non-traditional threats are those threats that go beyond the sovereignty of the states. Traditionally, those of us who study and teach security have been focused on the state. How do you protect sovereignty? How do you protect the borders of the state? How do you ensure that that state continues to be viable as an entity, both internally and as it engages on the world stage? Well, Nigeria, like many countries, focused on, hey, how do we prevent aggression? How do we prevent the state from actually being threatened? They forgot to address the non-traditional threats. And of course, this is coming back to haunt the Nigerian state. They forgot to address the desires and aspirations that pertain oftentimes to ethnicity and identity. As a result, you have, in the case of Nigeria, and we can talk about this in greater detail in the Q&A, you have Boko Haram emerging as a threat to the state. The very viability, the very survivability of the state is on the table. I don't care what my brothers in Nigeria tell me about, hey, we've defeated Boko Haram. Not true. You made defeat Boko Haram militarily, but the military is not the only tool you can deploy successfully to address non-traditional security threats. The other thing about Nigeria, one of the things that I've been spending a lot of time on, maritime security. Because of some of the things that I'm talking about, you have coastal regions just watching, looking as the money disappears. The money is extracted from their region and it just disappears into a corrupt infrastructure. I'm not saying that this is the only reason, but this is one of the reasons why you have a major, it's a really big issue when it comes to crime at sea. And when you look at the Gulf of Guinea, the entire Gulf of Guinea, the instability in the Gulf of Guinea is the origin, the source has one name. Now, I hope some of my Nigerian friends are here in the audience. One name, Nigeria. The vast majority of the pirates in the Gulf of Guinea are from Nigeria. And they're now making transnational connections. Very, very sophisticated stuff going on there. The Nigerians, just think about this, they're coming all the way down to Angola to hijack super tankers. So, this is one of the consequences that you get from focusing only on traditional security aspects. I wanted to just touch a little bit on civil society in Africa. And this is really, if you want to find reasons for optimism, if you want to find reasons for hope, you need to look at the development of civil society in Africa. For much of the post-independence period, up until the 1990s, basically, most African countries, you really did not have a civil society to speak of. That is not the case now. I was in Ghana a few months ago. I was just driving from meeting to meeting, and I told the driver, stop. Because I saw a headline in a newspaper that I couldn't believe it. So I got to get that newspaper. The headline was, "We are all corrupt." We are all corrupt. That was the headline. I picked up the newspaper, I read. It was about judges, all just across the country basically, taking bribes. Everything being taped. This journalist who basically just decided to do some investigative journalism, okay, undercover, and he uncovered rot in the judicial system. Why am I saying that? You go across the continent and you find a very vibrant, very, very vibrant media, independent press, very vibrant. And they are basically introducing an element of accountability and transparency that was not there till very recently. And we can talk about the media, we can talk about NGOs, we can talk about all other organizations that make up civil society, women's groups, youth groups, and environmental groups. I could go on and on and on. They are really working to reconstitute African society. They're working to reconstitute African society. And this is why I say that if you want to find reasons for optimism, look at civil society. And I would also especially look at the youth and the demands of the youth. The demands of the youth. Just to end my little contribution here, let me just talk a little bit about foreign relations. Foreign relations. How Africa is positioning itself on the world stage. Africans believe that Africa is important. And Africans understand that Africa has not really have a voice, as Stan was saying earlier, on global matters. And they want to change that. And they want to change that by coming together as a bloc and actually operating as a bloc on international fora. So when you go to the UN, the Africans basically will speak with one voice. There's 54 states speaking with one voice. You go to all international fora, the Africans are basically, amazingly, by and large, they are working together. This is really, really important. Because now you cannot discuss anything without asking the questions, hey, how are the Africans going to vote? How are the Africans going to vote? So that has made Africa really, really important. China has understood that better than anybody else. China has understood that better than anybody else. I remember being in Beijing 2004, 2005, and I asked one of my colleagues, an academic, say, tell me, why this turn? Why is China now so interested in Africa? He said, no, just look at history. This is nothing new to us. This is nothing new to us. We were there during the liberation period. We were there through the 1970s. The Cold War, we were there. And he reminded me that China basically, they paid, they constructed one of the biggest public works projects in Africa in the 1970s. It was Chinese. They built a railroad from Tanzania all the way to Zambia. All the way to Zambia. And he reminded me of something. He says, look, we're the Africans. The Africans who allowed China to take its place at the UN. Was the Africans. So the relationship between Africa and China goes back, quite a while. And he also reminded me that it goes back millennia. The commercial relationships trade between China and Africa goes back at least 1,000 years. So he told me, nothing new. Nothing new. And he reminded me something. Of course, he did not miss an opportunity to kind of, he reminded me that the United States was on the opposite side. During the liberation struggle, when China was on the side of the liberation movement, he asked me, where was the United States? It was supporting the oppressors. They're all NATO allies. During the Cold War, as China was trying to play a positive role to develop Africa, he asked me, where was the United States? The United States was busy supporting Mobutu. The United States was busy supporting Savimbi. The United States was busy supporting South Africa. he reminded me. Well, what about now? What is the United States doing to support Africa's development? I said, well, we're doing PEPFAR and we're doing, the MCC and stuff. We're busy. USAID spending billions. His retort was that, oh yeah, but if you ask the Africans, no, they prefer dealing with us. So, I guess I'm getting the sign to wrap up. Let me do that by thanking you all for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do you mind if I stand there? Okay, so let me follow up with a few remarks. I'm from Ghana. My name is Kweku Nwoma. I tell my students all the time, it sounds like a weird name, but it really means I'm a boy born on Wednesday. So it's very simple. I'm just going to follow up with some of the comments that he's made here. One of the things that we usually don't see at gatherings like this is any discussions on Africa. So thanks a lot, Stan, for putting Africa in the program. And we hope that the conversation continues. African states have been called all sort of names. They've been called soft states, weak states, fragile states, collapsed states. But the truth of the matter is that 50 years after independence, those states are not going anywhere. They are still here. And that's a remarkable feat in itself. In 1982, an important article came out, guys called Robert Jackson and Carl Rosberg. The title was, Why Do African States Persist? Why do the weak African states persist? And their answer to that question was that these states persist only as a function of international relations. International law is what preserves them. These are states that were created by international law, and even though they have de jure sovereignty, they really lack de facto sovereignty. But as those of you who are familiar with Africa know, once you become an African state, you can't die because the boundaries are frozen. At the OAU meeting in 1963 Cairo conference, the African states agreed to freeze the boundaries. The principle of iti possidetis kicked in. So you can't change the boundaries in Africa. There's only been 3 challenges in the 50 years or so to that boundary norm. Ethiopia, Eritrea became independent, breaking away, Western Sahara, and recently South Sudan. But all those cases actually affirmed the norm, because in Eritrea's case, it was able to point to a pre-existing Italian colonial boundary. So it was Ethiopia that had violated the norm. So under the norms, Eritrea was allowed to be an independent state. Then in the Western Sahara case, they were able to point to a pre-existing Spanish colonial boundary. And then in the Southern Sudan case, it's actually a negotiated secession. So you really cannot die as an African state. But that doesn't mean that you are fully functional. And so these are states that cannot perform the basic functions of the Leviathan, but cannot die. They become zombie states. And that's the argument that these guys were trying to make. But it's more than that. There's a reason why the Westphalian state model has not disappeared from Africa entirely. If you look at what has happened over 50 years, you can tell that most Africans, even if they're not happy with the state that they live in currently, are in agreement that they are better off than they were under colonial rule. So that's one. Most Africans have also settled the question of how they want to be governed. If you look at the recent Afrobarometer data that came out, most Africans prefer democracy as the mode of governance, even if they've not perfected it yet. So that issue has been resolved. And Africa is making progress in little areas. So malaria, for example, which is the biggest problem on the continent in terms of public health. There's progress against that. Conflicts are under control. Conflicts are part of the process of nation building. And with the boundary norm alone, and you might think that it's a small thing, but the boundary norm has prevented all kinds of conflicts because nobody's happy with their boundaries in Africa. So the moment you start tinkering with it, you're going to have wars all over the place. So the decision in 1963 not to do anything about the colonial boundaries has prevented a lot of conflicts, even though we've seen some other types of conflicts within the states, and every now and then there is border wars between neighboring states. But you could have a lot more crisis going on in the place. Other areas where Africa has made some progress, little things like gender equality. Have you taken a look at Rwanda recently? If you look at Rwanda, for example, labor force participation for women in Rwanda is 84%. Do you know what the number is for the United States? United States is 66%. If you, again, Rwanda, the percentage of government and elected positions held by women, 64% in Rwanda. United States is only at 19%. So there are, progress here and there. Environmental security, science. You won't find any serious African leader that disputes global warming, for example, or evolution, as you find in America from time to time. These are settled issues. But there are still challenges. There are still important challenges. So I'm going to touch on a few. Then what I also want to do is I want to talk about the concept of sovereignty within the African context. And then if there's time, I want to quickly take you to West Africa and show you how some of the issues that we're talking about is playing out. So the challenges that are important, in my opinion, governance. So Freedom House, for example, the latest report that came out, only 12% of Africans live in free societies. Only 3% enjoy free press. So that's not good. If you take a look at the Fragile State Index, 2015, produced by the Fund for Peace, 7 out of the top 10 most vulnerable countries on that list are in Africa. You look at the 2015 Corruption Perception Index, produced by Transparency International. 6 of the top 10 worst performers when it comes to corruption are in Africa. And then if you take a look at any of the major lists that rank universities in the world, there's only one African university in the top 200. That's the University of Cape Town. So these are things that tell me that going forward, the continent has a lot of work to do if we want to be successful. I want to talk about sovereignty in the African context. There are 3 important phases of sovereignty if you want to do a categorization. As with all societies, people want to have a say in how they are governed, but more importantly, they want to have a say in their own affairs. They want greater control over their destiny. That in an African context, it means being able to build a state that's autonomous, an Africa that can say no in the international public square, that can stand on its own 2 feet. And there are different ways that this concept has manifested. So the first important phase is the resistance to colonial rule. There's resistance to colonial rule. We tend to not realize that there was resistance. We think that, the partition of Africa, the Berlin Conference, 1884, 1885, no African countries present, with the exception of, I think, Ethiopia and Liberia that were, observers. The Europeans draw the map, they grab the continent. There's no resistance. But there are all kinds of different African groups that push back. And if you go through the history, you will see. So you have the Maji uprisings against German colonialism in Tanzania, the Mau Mau rebellions in Kenya against the British, led by Dedan Kimathi. You have Ethiopia pushing back against the Italians at the Battle of Adowa, Ghana, the Battle of Isimanko, 1824, where the British governor, Sir Charles Makati, was captured and beheaded. Then, of course, even more recent, the Yasantua War, 1900, the Yasantua, the Queen Mother of Jiso, an old lady at 60, mobilizing what remained of the Ashanti army against the mighty British Empire. So all of these things are there, and these are episodes in African desire to express sovereignty, to take charge of their own destiny. Then the second phase, once colonial rule is established, struggles within the colonial states for greater rights. So fights for rights under colonial rule, the Aborigines Rights Protection Society in Ghana, National Congress for British West Africa, this mostly elites asking the colonial state to do more, to allow them. So if you get a sense of what a colonial state looked like, if you were native, you had no rights. You had no rights. And as Assis was saying, this colonial state was not a democratic state. So the elites are usually the first ones to stand up. They push for that. And then later on, particularly after the Second World War, it blossoms into a full-fledged demand for independence. Starting with Ghana. Ghana is the first country that achieved self-governance in 1951, becoming independent in 1956, 1957, going through the Portuguese decolonization efforts, all the wars in the 1970s. By 1980, Africa is fully decolonized now, both Zimbabwe, and then, of course, 1994, apartheid ends in South Africa. So that's the second phase of African quest to express sovereignty. And then the third and most important phase, in my opinion, is the challenge to build the post-colonial state and all the transactions that's taking place within that space, how to transform the state, what Nkrumah called the political kingdom, from one that is experiencing only de jure sovereignty to one that has de facto sovereignty, the one that can defend its borders, the one that can deliver the services negotiated under the social contract to its citizens, a state that is respected in the community of nations. So there's a bunch of stuff, and this involves delivery of political goods, economic development. African countries have done all sort of things. They've experimented with all kinds of models of economic development. Some work, some don't work. Good governance, pushing back against military rule, all of that. And then in the latest manifestation of that push, we see African states pushing back against what they perceive to be neo-colonial attempts to control the destiny of Africans through international institutions. Now, some of these protests are overstated, in my opinion. For example, the pushback against the ICC, the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court has come under heavy criticism because it seems to target only Africans. But in my opinion, it's not targeting good African leaders. It's targeting African leaders who have done horrible things, sometimes to their own people, that they cannot be put on trial at home because the institutions are too weak. So the courts is helping, but at the same time, a court that targets only Africans is a court that lacks credibility, even if the prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, is from Africa. So that's part of that stuff. And every now and then, African leaders can always reach into the old bag of neo-colonial resentment against neo-colonialism and say, we are being targeted because they don't want us to be free. It's not always true. It's not always true. But again, if you can always blame somebody for your problems, then there's no incentive to fix them. So that's what part of the problem going forward. Now, I want to talk a little bit, Stan, I have a few more minutes. I want to talk about West Africa, because what I want to do is I want to do a case and show you what's happening in a place like West Africa where, as it's already talked about, Boko Haram, that's one of the biggest security challenges going forward, but they're not the only ones operating in a place like that. We've had a bunch of groups in Mali, Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, recently bombed in these places. As we see the competition for control over the political space, it's part of the process of political development. But there's all kinds of things happening. We've seen Al-Qaeda influencing groups in the Sahel. As major states collapse, they become refuge for terrorists. So a lot of these problems are there. Another thing that's important in terms of security is conflicts, and we've seen all kinds of conflicts in Africa. We've seen secessionist movements in Nigeria, in Mali, Senegal. We've seen border wars, Nigeria and Cameroon, for example, Mauritania and Senegal. We've seen civil wars, other countries that collapsed, the countries that were propped up by the Cold War. After the end of the Cold War, they become orphans, they implode. So we see Sierra Leone, Liberia, even Ivory Coast, that for a long time people thought Ivory Coast was, was a country that had done well. Ivory Coast collapsed. So these things are not something that you can take lightly. Then we've seen tensions over cross-border subversive activity, Ghana promoting coups in Togo and vice versa, the Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, destabilizing countries in the region, and the Fulani pastoralists, crossing borders, bringing conflict, raiding villages. There's a whole lot of stuff that's happening over there. And then, of course, ethnic conflicts, because as he said, there are a lot of different ethnicities, which are actually nations within these, forced to live within the modern entity of a Westphalian state. And they have to share that space. They have to make decisions about how they're going to be governed. There's relative deprivation, so one group gets this, another group wants that. There's all kinds of tensions within these states. And that's why we're going to keep having these conflicts. Then, of course, there are human security issues. So you guys remember just a couple of years ago, 2014, I think, the Ebola stuff, the Ebola scare, that was a huge challenge. And I think the African states actually did better. I mean, if you compare it to how the hysteria in the United States, all the stuff that happened, these African states, they just kept quiet and they dealt with it. They dealt with it. Countries that have nothing, countries that are poor, they managed to beat it back. Americans were freaking out, over this stuff. So they've made this progress. Now, I already told you about malaria. Malaria, the rate has decreased by 54% since 2000. That's a lot of progress. And then polio, for example, has been eradicated. So that's the good news. Of course, governance, as he already said, there's entrenched dictatorships all over the place. And then, if you keep watching, there's troubled transitions ahead. So places like Sierra Leone, even Ghana. Ghana has gotten the past, but let me tell you, keep watching Ghana with the elections coming up. If it's a close resort, you might have some type of conflict. In the Ivory Coast, after Ouattara leaves, you're probably going to have some type of conflict. And then, of course, coups in West Africa, rampant. I'm going to wind up. Only one country, Senegal, is the only country that hasn't had any coups. So there are a bunch of different things. Briefly, economics, some challenges, but also opportunities. So the youth bulge, for example, is both a challenge, but also an opportunity. Economic crisis, particularly with the slowing down of China, that's led to it's impacted. Chinese imports from Africa has dropped by 32%. And if you add that to the drop in oil prices, all the petro economies in Africa, in West Africa, for example, Nigeria, they are losing out, they are shrinking. Nigeria is in trouble. Nigeria is just, the economic growth has reduced significantly. 70% of their GDP comes from oil, so when the prices drop from $115 to now about $40, that affects them, and it leads to all kinds of problems. But there's also hope. We've seen smooth transitions, Guinea, Nigeria, Senegal, Burkina Faso after the coup. Benin just had good elections. And again, in terms of the economics, I'm going to end on economics. We're seeing uptick in DFI flows. Africa for a long time got only about 3% of foreign direct investments. It's gone up now. It's about 5.2, which is higher than the average for developing countries. Same with economic growth. So there's future. The future looks good. I think the future looks good. African countries are figuring out how to solve these problems, but they're going to need help from a lot of places, including the United States. I'm going to stop here, and then we'll do a question and answer.
1, 2. Hello. Let me make a few quick comments. If you look at a map of Africa, the way it was cut up by the colonial powers, it's really very interesting because, you're the colonial powers at the end of the century looking to carve up Africa. and you have to determine where you draw the borders. First of all, rivers make good borders. So they started with rivers. Anywhere there was a river, they put a country to one side of the river, that was a country. To the other side of the river, that was a country. And then if you look at the map of Africa, you see a lot of straight lines. And that's the next thing they did, was simply draw straight lines, north and south, and east and west. And of course, with hundreds, if not thousands of ethnic groups on the continent, you simply destroyed that ethnic consistency. But if you really look at Africa, it's fascinating. You got the rivers and you got straight lines, and that busted up ethnic groups completely, but that's essentially the way they did it. And the other thing I'll make very quickly in terms of education, the French believed that they could select certain Africans for advanced education. And you saw a lot of the early leaders of French independence, of African independence, from the French colonies who were educated at the Sorbonne in Paris. And so they selected certain Africans that they thought had great potential, and they sent them to Paris, and you had this cadre of educated Africans in the 60s who then became the presidents and prime ministers. Opposite the Belgian example, the Belgians thought they had kind of an arrogance to their colonial power and their colonial effects and philosophy. They sent everybody through 6th grade, but no farther. So you had this huge mass in the middle of the African continent, and it's the size of the United States, what is today the Congo, and you simply carved it up and you sent everybody through 6th grade, but nobody after 6th grade. And so when you had independence in 1960, in the Belgian Congo, you had something like 12 people who had been to university. And of course, that created all sorts of havoc. So it's not a rationale, but I think it's an explanation. Let me quickly ask Colonel Kebe if you will make a quick comment, because Senegal was significantly identified as a place where the transition to democracy has worked. And can we get some of your views on it, perhaps?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I will make a quick comment, and then I will ask a question also. I think Dr. Kwaku has talked about Senegal, who was the only state in West Africa who has not experienced a military coup. And this is maybe explain a little bit the specificity of Senegal, because most of African countries are plagued by the ethnic groups. And generally, you know, in the political level as well as in the military level, people have been selected according sometimes to the ethnicity of the ruling leader. And those kind of behaviors have been really a problem for most of the countries. Hence the provision of coup after the independence. Senegal has never had this problem because only we have a restricted number of ethnicity, and also because we have finally a professional army, Republican, and who accept that the civilian leaders who are elected have to rule, and the military have to stay, you know, in the military level to do their professional job for the sovereignty of the country. Now I would like to raise a question. First, a little statement. At the beginning of our independence, there was a book that was considered as a scandal. René Dumont wrote a book called L'Afrique est mal partie, or Black Africa is missing the boat, meaning is having a bad start. And also, 2 decades later, he persisted by writing another book, Africa, Strangled Africa. And in 1992, an African writer this time, Axel Kabou, raise the question, est-ce si l'Afrique refusait le développement, or what if Africa doesn't feel like developing? These pessimistic statements have been rejected by African leaders. Now, 50 years after our independence, what is, according to you, the validity of such statements, and also how do you foresee the future of the African countries within the 50 coming years? Thank you.
What's a question there? And then we'll go back to your... Okay, yes, and tell where you're from, please.
My name is Kukuvi Amosu. I'm Brigadier General from Benin. I'm Defense Attaché. I'm so happy to attend this meeting, and I thank both the speakers, Dr. Assis Malakias and Dr. Kwaku Nwama. I want to inform you first that my country is celebrating democracy today because the former president has retired today and the new president has entered into his new function since 3 or 4 hours. So Africa is able to sustain democracy as Dr. Malakias Assis has stated it. Democracy is taking root in Africa. But democracy is not sufficient. We need development to face our common enemy, poverty. Africa is a great continent. Africa is the cradle of mankind. And oftentimes, people say that Africa is a kind of geological scandal. Why? Because Africa is one of the richest parts of the earth in natural resources. But Africa is also a territory where you can find that people are facing daily a higher level of poverty. While speaking, Dr. Assis Malakias stated that money is extracted but disappear from Africa. He has emphasized one of the causes of this phenomenon: corruption. Corruption. But I want to ask both the speakers if they think that corruption is the only cause to explain the delay of African countries in their development. That is the first question. Before going ahead for the 2 following questions, I want to make 3 statements. The first one, many specialists in economics stated that currency remains the cornerstone of economics policy. Currency is the cornerstone of economic policy. First statement. Second statement, 15 African countries and the Comoros, in this case, the countries of the CFA France zone has no control over the currency CFA France, which really is not their own. Third statement, sovereignty is a triangular edifice with 3 pillars. The first pillar is economic, with currency as the centerpiece. The second pillar is defense. The third pillar is positive law as basic for democracy. Now, here is my first question, which is really the second. My question addresses both speakers. Do you think that it is possible to talk about a real and true independence for the above stated countries with an almost total lack of control over a currency which seems not to be their own? Second question. How do you explain that the former British colonies are clearly much more advanced in development today than the French-speaking in terms of development indicators? Don't be amazed to hear me speaking such a way, because that is my opinion. All territory of our whole world where there is serious issues of sovereignty is a breeding ground for the proliferation of fundamentalist preaching. I repeat, every part of this world, of our land, where there is serious issues of sovereignty is a breeding territory for fundamentalist preaching. So if sovereignty is an issue of a triangle, I think that Africa is both a challenge and opportunity for the whole world. How do you think that the international community is going to face this challenge, helping those countries becoming truly, really, definitely, accurately free? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to give you each 1 minute to answer that, and then we're going to have to wrap this up, and you can come back to it. We do have somebody from Africa. Yeah, we've got another question there? One more question, okay. All right, you guys get 1 minute, and then we'll take one more question.
Okay, maybe we should do a bit of a division of labor. Very quickly, on the question that the good colonel from Senegal asked, where is the place of pessimism in the current discourse, and where do we see Africa in 50 years? It's easy to be a pessimist. It's very, very easy to be a pessimist. It's much more difficult to be an optimist. It's even more difficult to be a realist. And I think that we need to be realistic about Africa, where Africa is coming from, where Africa is, and where Africa is going. Africa is coming from a not so good place. Africa today is finding its feet. And Africa of the future is the new frontier, is the last frontier. So you have to be very, very optimistic about Africa. Its potential to develop the continent, because everything is there. I'm an economist by training. And everything that you need to develop a space is there in Africa. The challenge now is, how do we manage those processes? That is the key challenge. So 1 minute, half a minute for him. General, you make some very, very good points. Make some very good points. But I think that definitionally, it's important that we do not collapse independence and sovereignty. There's a distinction there between independence and sovereignty. Africa, the African states are sovereign. Independence is a lot more difficult because it touches on some of those factors that you mentioned, you know, economics, politics, and so on and so forth. On the currency, yes, you need to start somewhere. But there has to be a connection between your currency and your economy. What's really, really important is the economy. That's what you need to focus on. Making sure that the basics are there, the foundations for the economy are solid. You have the legal framework to ensure that everything goes the way it's supposed to go. I could go on and on and on, but the timekeeper is saying, stop. And I gotta respect that.
Okay.
Okay, so thanks for the intervention. And if I can just comment on your question, you asking about Afro-pessimism, and both internal and external, right? But you know, I think there's nothing wrong with people being pessimistic. It's actually what makes people want to work hard when you question their ability to do stuff. And the fact of the matter is that their condition of life on the continent is below where we should expect it to be. Usually people lower the standards when it comes to Africa. And so, when you go over there and you don't die, then everything is good. But that's that's too low a standard. And so people are, right to question whether Africa has done all that it can with he just talked about that. The continent is rich. It has all kinds of, Ali Mazruri's paradox. It's the richest continent in terms of natural endowment, and it has the world's poorest people. So there's a problem there. And so people are right to raise these questions. It's up to Africans to change minds by showing that we can address our problems. And coming back to your questions, you have a couple of things that quickly I want to talk about. Monetary policy is important, but the reason why you have these countries sharing the currency, first of all, is to expand their markets. And so there's a good reason for that. You can have your own currency that nobody respects. And essentially, a lot of African countries, by default, are using the American dollar because they can't support their own currencies. And there's inflation. So yes, having control over your monetary policy is important for development. But you also have to realize these are tiny countries, some of whom are not viable independently. That's the truth of the matter. There are countries in Africa that are probably not viable if they are going to go alone. So having a larger trading bloc has its benefits, and that's what the monetary policy that you're talking about is. You asked a question about Anglophone versus Francophone. That's interesting because if you go to some Anglophone countries, they also think that the Francophones are ahead. So it's a question of where you stand. But I guess you can go back to the differential policies under the French colonial rule and the British colony. The British didn't care too much about their colonies. The French cared probably too much, and the assimilationist policies probably didn't help you. So it's hard to develop when everybody loves you, and that's the problem. France loves its colonies too much, whereas the British didn't care about Nigeria or Ghana, so you really had to do things for yourself.
Okay, we're going to have to stop there, but I think we've clearly tapped into something that, all right, one more, very quickly, please. I'm going to get killed here if it's not quick. So,
my question is to Dr. Assis. I think the question that I would like to ask, I know it might be a little bit tricky actually for me to say it, but I will say it anyway. Do you think the West want Africa to be stable? Do you think that the West, and when I say West, I'm talking about state and industry, private industry. Do they want Africa to be stable? When I talk about stability, I'm talking about education, I'm talking about social stability, I'm talking about economical stability. Thank you.
Well, that's the
Quickly,
easiest
please.
question I've ever been asked to answer in my entire life. Short answer, yes.